of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homelands of Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Ladies and gentlemen, as I was speaking about Project IDEA stands for Identify, Demystify, and Empower, countering disinformation on Ukrainian war. The project supports is funded by Digital Citizenship Contribution Program, Canada, and it started on April of this year and will be completed in March 2023. The project is located in Winnipeg, Manitoba. It supports Government of Canada's three objectives. It helps to develop the tools and skills necessary to better equip Canadians in the face of disinformation and other related online harms and threats to our country's democracy and social cohesion. Secondly, it helps to build capacity to address disinformation and other related online harms and threats, and it also protects our country's democracy and social cohesion through expert knowledge and enhanced cooperation and knowledge through key government activities. And finally, it also empowers Canadians to take steps to mitigate against the potential impact of disinformation. Project IDEA that we have come up with aims to counter Russian disinformation campaign related to Ukraine war propagating through online social media as well as mainstream print and electronic media. The audience, Ukraine war has now into fourth month of its happening since last February. During this war, of course, the battle is fought on the ground, but also there is a battle continuously being fought in cyberspace. This particular battle is aimed at influencing people's behavior in Canada, in America, and many of the Western allies whose values are very similar with regards to human rights and individual liberty. This is why this project aims to educate people about the harms of disinformation and how to combat it. With this brief introduction, ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to welcome and introduce our special guest today, Kate Wekesser-English, and she's the Executive Director of Educators in Human Rights, and she has served as an executive leadership board positions since Educator for Human Rights, established in 2011. Kate taught for 18 years in Connecticut and Virginia public schools and has been recognized as District-wide Teacher of the Year, received the Joseph Zola Holocaust Educator, and serves as a Museum Teacher Fellow for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She holds credentials from the University of Connecticut, Georgetown University, and George Mason University. Kate attended Summer University in Srebrenica, served as a Teaching Excellence and Achievement Fellow in Ukraine through IREX and U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. She is a Positive Peace Ambassador with the Institute for Economics and Peace and recently completed the Summer Institute for Genocide Studies and Prevention and Keene State College, and where I met Kate. And this is such a fascinating story, and her experience really coincide with the project's objective. And this is one of the reasons that I requested Kate to kindly come and speak for us. Without further ado, let me go and welcome Kate to the floor. Kate, floor is yours. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here tonight. I'm pleased to share some of our work and to have this conversation that we know is very important, both in Canada and here in the United States, with events that have been happening in recent years. I do have a soft spot for Canada. My daughter lives in Toronto. She's about to get married at Niagara-on-the-Lake, and we're all looking forward to celebrating after waiting for 2 years. So, so part of my heart is quite literally in Canada. And so I'm particularly pleased to be with you this evening for that reason. So I think I have some slides prepared, and if I may, I'm just going to go ahead and get those up on the screen. It'll just take me a moment.
Dear audience, while Kate is preparing her slide to be up, let me also welcome our advisors, David Newman and Gary Senf, to be with us. Thank you so much, sir, for sparing your time to join in this very important discussion. And also we have Kwazo, our research assistant for this project with us this evening. Kate, your slide is up here.
Great, thank you very much. So as Kauser mentioned, I'm with the Educators Institute for Human Rights. And this evening we're talking about a comparative approach to disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. Just a little bit about our organization before we get going. As you heard in my biography, I spent 18 years in public school classrooms teaching students from grade 6 through grade 8 and working with students in high school in a number of different after-school activities, mostly relating to human rights. You see our mission statement here in text, and then you are the first people to publicly see the latest draft of the front page of our new website. It's not ready to launch yet, but I did capture this screenshot. We're very excited about it. And you can see that what we do is really take rooted in the lessons of the Holocaust, decades of experience with pedagogy, finding out what works, finding out what's not effective or can even be harmful, and moving forward with quality curriculum to work with students on difficult content. A group of us decided that we wanted to start sharing with teachers in other locations. And we started in Rwanda to really have a conversation. We have this understanding of Holocaust education, and we wanted to share that, but most importantly, to hear from Rwandan teachers how they approach their own history and how we can bring those things together. Now that led to more conversations in other places, and just show you a few of those. So we started in Rwanda. Next, we went to Bosnia and Herzegovina, Cambodia. I don't need to list them all for you as they come up. The most recent ones we are doing through a project with the Seven Foundation called Imagine Reflections on Peace that currently has an exhibition at the United States Institute for Peace. But what we strive to do is not only for us to connect with teachers in these places, but to connect everyone to each other. So, and at this point, I can say we've successfully been pulling together teachers from Argentina, from Northern Ireland, from Bosnia and Herzegovina, from Rwanda, and so forth, and particularly most recently, the Democratic Republic of Congo, to have conversations about what works, what do we need, what do we want to build, and every time we find something new, someone brings a whole new idea that we never would have thought of without them, and we find that to be the most rewarding part of what we do. So this evening, we're talking about what the Canadian government refers to as MDM, or misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And so how is it defined? Misinformation is false information. It's really not meant to cause any harm. Disinformation is intended to manipulate, cause damage, and generally use information for evil, not for good. And malinformation, it's going off of the truth, but it's often an exaggeration in a way that misleads and can cause potential harm. So one directly, intentionally giving out information, knowing that it's incorrect and intending to cause harm. And the other, exaggerating. And so as I said before, we're rooted in Holocaust education practices. And one way to think about this is that, there's out and out Holocaust or genocide denial in certain circumstances. And then there's the distortion, which we would think of as malinformation. So it might be the acknowledgement of certain aspects, but then stretching around things, telling just enough of the truth to make it believable, but then putting in information that goes way off track. I'm going to note that on these, when you see lots of these are linked, so you can get right to those definitions from the Government of Canada. Propaganda, and this comes from work at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, from their installation called, I'm forgetting it now, State of Deception, there it is. All I can think of is that it's the Propaganda Project, but it was some years ago. It's still available on their website. I believe that this link will take you directly to that material. And so that was defined as biased information that's intentionally spread to shape public opinion and behavior. That can be for good things. I mean, think of Smokey the Bear, or I don't know the Canadian equivalent, but some lovable figure that's guiding children to make good decisions, for example. That could be that's a form of propaganda. It doesn't have to be a negative. And some of the techniques included in propaganda are bandwagoning, plain folks, glittering generalities, testimonial, emotional pleas. We all know that one, Canadian Sarah McLachlan, and the commercials about rescuing animals would definitely be an emotional plea, and beautiful people. So I tend to think of Julia Roberts in Paris selling perfume on that one. Some common traits of propaganda are coming up now. It's true, partially true, or blatantly false. It can be selective in omitting things. It definitely just simplifies things so much that it may even become trivializing of something serious. It works on emotions, and it works on all those unconscious hopes, fears, and desires that we have. It gives permission to a targeted audience to think a certain way, and I think that's in our conversation about what's happening in the world today, here in the United States, certainly, and perhaps with the truck convoy there in Canada, I think we're seeing some of that permission definitely having an impact. And it uses a lot of different media, and this has images, words, music, and of course, symbols, and of course, all different forms of things on the internet. And it's not looking to have a reasoned factual argument. It's looking for everybody to come to an agreement about something. So, examples from the Holocaust. So you may recognize or not this poster. It goes into what are known as the Nuremberg laws, and this particularly is defining who is and who is not a Jew. It's showing you who can and cannot marry under those circumstances. And of course, once they've defined the group, then they can start to set laws that are more and more restrictive, and of course, leading to genocide. We also can see the deep roots of anti-Semitism and of anti-Jewish propaganda starting very early. If you can see my pointer, this book right here is called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It stemmed from a work in France. Then in Russia, that idea was taken and twisted and made to create this fictitious world of a Jewish international conspiracy. And if that sounds familiar, it's because we can't shake this thing. That piece of propaganda has gotten roots and runs pretty deep. The minute that it left the Russian borders by about 1920s and 30s, the minute it got published in other places, scholars jumped all over it and proved it wrong 11, 12 bazillion different ways. And it didn't matter. People still believe it to this day. There are countries in which it is in reference libraries as a nonfiction work. Reaching children was incredibly important to the Nazis, as it is to all. Teaching is important, but to integrate this propaganda and indoctrinate them in Nazi thinking, we can find some things that would be seemingly innocuous, but they are just filled with anti-Semitism. And in this case, what you see in the lower right corner is a game that's called Jews Out. And it's, reminds me of a game when I was growing up called Trouble. You just move the pieces around and then you land on it and they go off the board. But in this case, it's all about sending those Jews away. And you can see the anti-Semitic character on the hat of the piece there on the board. And then finally, we can see that, and this one is linked. I'm not gonna go there because I'm afraid I'll lose the screen. But this is looking at propaganda around the Jews influencing this partnership between Great Britain and Russia to fight, and that the Jews were behind that union that ultimately brings Nazi Germany down. And so you can see the early roots of propaganda, of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation in all of these examples. If we look in other places for similar examples, historically, in very recent history, but also in World War II, and I always feel that it's important as an American that we acknowledge what we contribute to these atrocities, to this history. And so going back to the earliest ones, we see here from the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, which is in Minnesota. And we work on some projects with them and have great, deep respect for their work. You can see that we start with this quote from General Pratt, who was a Union soldier, or actually, I don't recognize the uniform. He's an American soldier. I'm not sure what year that is, the cavalry, 15th Cavalry. But he has one of the most famous quotes that's attributed to the boarding school movement, and that is that he excuses the whole only good Indian is a dead Indian and tries to apologize for it and reframe it by saying, kill the Indian in him and save the man, that's the purpose of boarding schools. That is a form of genocide, to remove children and try and indoctrinate them in a different, to rob them of their culture. And I can't think of a better example than this one. And this, again, this photo from the Boarding School Healing Coalition, we see this young woman, a photograph of her before and then after in this wedding picture after forced assimilation. Let's see. During World War II here in the United States, you're probably aware that we had Japanese internment camps. Now, this war poster up above, it's intended, it does something that happens with most military conflicts, and that's demonizing the enemy. But in so doing, it makes it a race-based identification, and the Japanese on the West Coast particularly are targeted for ethnic cleansing. It might be a way to think of it. I don't know precisely what definition we would apply, because there's not an intent to destroy the group, but rather to contain them. And ostensibly, Roosevelt wanted to do that for their own protection, but of course, we know better. And so, in this link, you'll see here, you could click and see that that proclamation from Roosevelt itself. And then in this article here, and this section, there's a representative from California who said he spoke to 15 Western states in the United States, to governors, and 9 of them replied about this whole proposition, that no Japanese were wanted in their states except in concentration camps. So the propaganda about Japan and the Japanese, took on it became very insidious and took hold in ways with the American population at home that we are not proud of. Moving forward to these 2 events in Bosnia and in Rwanda. The one in Bosnia is interesting because it's actually, and you may notice it's written in English. This isn't a Serbian piece of propaganda about the Bosniaks. It's actually written by a UN soldier in the compound at Srebrenica. And what I particularly like about this artifact is that that at the museum that's now on the site in Srebrenica, they've turned that into a point of pride, something that a point of defiance against that. They've flipped it on its ear and made it something where they counter that argument very strongly with the, of course, beautiful, intelligent, strong women that are in Bosnia today and have been always. In Rwanda, these 2 pieces particularly are illustrative of things that we heard in the Holocaust. The idea of referring to Tutsis as cockroaches, and the Jews were referred to as vermin and rats in the film The Eternal Jew. They show all these rats running and imply that that's what Jews are like and why we need to get rid of them. And so the same thing is happening in Rwanda in 1994. And here you can see in the original French, what are called the Hutu 10 Commandments. And they list in much the same way that we saw on the poster on who's a Jew and who's not a Jew, and who can marry and who cannot marry. It's a very similar set of rules that come out that are an example of misinformation, disinformation, propaganda. So now we turn to the war in Ukraine. There have been a lot of things flying around on the internet. Brings us up to modern day misinformation. I particularly want to point out this photograph because here in this corner, because of how far back this accusation of Ukraine and NATO, in this case specifically, really being a Nazi organization. This is from the trip that I took to Ukraine as a teacher exchange, and in a high school classroom in Hadyach in 2009. the man that you see there is a local bureaucrat. He's, and they come in and do a presentation with the kids in their senior year, and they're trying to emphasize the importance of pushing for Ukraine, even in 2009, to join NATO and to think about the European Union as a goal. Bearing in mind that at this point it's a very young independence, and so they really want to speak to young people about what it means to be Ukrainian. And they have seen these kinds of hate symbols showing up on the internet, particularly generated from those areas in Crimea and the south part of Ukraine along the coast, depicting NATO as a Nazi organization. And here you can see, there's Uncle Sam and so all these different symbols of NATO. And there's another one, the other photo is out of focus, but you can see that they actually put a swastika into this setting, and it's meant to obviously convey NATO as a Nazi organization. Then we see that Putin once again tries to pick up on that message, insinuating and out and out saying that that the Ukrainians are Nazis, and that that's the reason they have to go in and take over. That's the reason for the invasion. And of course, you probably already know that not only is President Zelensky Jewish, but his family members were in the Holocaust. So of course, it's nonsensical. It makes no sense at all. These three images here, this one will take you to a report on National French News that digs in deep on and with balance on some of the misinformation that's going around the internet. And you'll notice the symbol here on his shirt. This was a big one that flew around the internet. They were implying that it was the Iron Cross of the Nazis that he was wearing. And of course, it's the Ukrainian cross that you can see here on the screen. And here we have straight up photo doctoring, where they took a jersey that you can see the jersey here, and then superimpose this swastika on it. So that's unfortunately part of what's happening in Russia, is the cutting off of outside information. And again, we saw that with the Nazis, with the Volksradio, and the limitation. The only thing you could be listening to were the Nazi stations, and so you're only getting one source of information. Here in the United States, it's been a sequence of events that's led us to what happened on January 6th and to the committee hearings that we're witnessing today. It goes far back to Donald Trump's original assertion that President Obama was not an American citizen, that he didn't have a birth certificate, that he was born in Kenya, all of these lies that he kept repeating. And here we see some of the political cartoons from that community depicting him as a snake, and disputing there really were no scandals except for the tan suit jacket that President Obama wore. We see people at a rally here during the first election in 2016 with these depictions of Hillary Clinton needing to be locked up for having her emails, things that all had been, did she make mistakes? Yes, she made mistakes. Did she own them? She certainly did in front of Congress. And they determined that there was no criminal wrongdoing. So there's no reason to call for her to be locked up. These start showing up about the same time. We start seeing white supremacy become prevalent. This event in Charlottesville in 2016 horrified all of us. And as you may know, was the catalyst for why Joe Biden decided to run for president. And we see it spill over into the situation with COVID-19. I know you're also seeing this in Canada, the vaccine deniers, the mask, people who don't want to wear masks. That was perpetuated here largely by this same, Make America Great Again crew. This one I put just because of the ridiculousness of it. This is a man who professes Christianity, but doesn't practice it in any way, shape, or form, has no history of practicing it. But we have an image of Jesus Christ on his shoulders, blessing him, essentially. And of course, we have Fox News, which contributes a great deal to misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation here in the United States. So all of these things together get us to a point where this becomes possible. These are marchers at this point. These people aren't in the Capitol yet, but you can see that it's a sea of people coming to do what they believe is factually correct, that they need to go in and stop the verification of the electoral college votes, and that somehow they're going to overturn the election, which is really a coup d'etat. It's an overthrow of a legitimate government. And that is why we're in the situation we're in today with the hearings. So what do we do about it? Well, here are a few great resources. And these are, if there's an image on this page, there's a link to what I'm talking about. We'll start with Namely. That is a U.S. organization that's focused on media literacy, and they cover a number of things. But particularly, they have great information on discerning between legitimate, illegitimate sources, what to think about before you forward something or repost something. Wow, I just went back to email, forward something, reshare it is what I meant, of course. I also like On the Media. This is in the States, this often broadcasts on NPR, National Public Radio. And this one, they do keep up to date different examples of how to keep up with breaking news events. And the kinds of things they talk about are, be careful of those reports that come out in the moment. News organizations are so competitive. They want to get things out first and not necessarily getting it out accurately. And we have examples of even some of the most esteemed news organizations making those mistakes. Here is a part of that curriculum that I mentioned earlier from the propaganda exhibition at the Holocaust Museum. And this one particularly is about analyzing memes. So it takes the information from Nazi propaganda with their materials and their resources and creates a set of lessons for analyzing memes on the internet today. This right here is Abby Richards. And again, it'll take you right to her TikTok. And it was recommended by Namely. And I've watched several of these. I mean, they do include the trucker convoys. The first one I watched was the Misinformation on Ukraine. And you'll see here that what she's doing throughout is she's researching extremism. She's looking at disinformation, and she's myth busting, right? And so what I like about them, again, is that they're something that young people are connecting to. They're very digestible. They're short. They're punchy. They're all the things that young people appreciate, and get to the point of things very quickly, and with a lot of research behind it. So much to be admired there in places where social media can be used to help solve problems rather than simply create them. If you'd like to get in touch with us, here's all of our links, social media. We have wonderful t-shirts. You're going to see that new website open up soon. I will share this PowerPoint presentation with the organization. So if there's a way to share it beyond this presentation, I'm more than happy to make that available. And with that, Hauser, I give it back to you. And we'll stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you so much, Kate. I think it's absolutely brilliant presentation, and it contains a lot of information that we are actually working on. And our sincere thanks, Kate, to bring it all together within a brief span of 20-25 minutes. So, dear audience, we will switch to conversational mode now. And now let me bring our advisors into the discussion. We have first David Newman with us. David, you had been listening quite intently the first half of the presentation. And now it is, I will hand over the floor to you. If you have any questions for Kate, please go ahead, sir.
Yeah, very quickly, Kate, this is a wonderful summary, very quickly presented, but very impactfully and very relevant to what we're doing. I noted that you were a positive peace ambassador for Institute for Economics and Peace, which of course is a strategic alliance with Rotary International. And we have had Steve Killalay, the founder of the Global Peace Index and IEP in Winnipeg. And as a matter of fact, just before I came into this show, I was involved in a communication with the leaders in Rotary International staff in Evanston, Illinois, about
I know some of
bringing
the folks. Yes. Yeah.
about bringing down into the communities of the world the implementation of positive peace and its measurability. And essential in the Rotary world is truth as the primary way of doing self-analysis about what you think and what you say and what you do. And it starts off with, is it the truth? And then it moves to, is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? And what you've given is some very useful definitions and guidance as to how we can deal with each of the Canadian government's definitions of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And we have recognized through the first session that we had in this series by Crick, that the complexity of monitoring all of this in the world outside the classroom, which you've been a very important part of, is very, very difficult. And educating the vast world of users of the internet to deliberately spread misinformation or malinformation, but also Rotarians and others with the best of intentions innocently spreading misinformation. And an example that came up in our first session was some Rotary clubs in different parts of the world said that Rotary International had a seat at the United Nations.
Oh my.
And that was a loose jargon in the eyes of the innocent misusers of that misinformation. For Rotary has civil society representation at a high level at the United Nations. So what I really, with that background, ask you is, what is the best way to deal with this vast majority of humanity who have access to communication tools that can spread so widely and so impactfully, especially amongst vulnerable peoples, all three of those kinds of informations. And you've named some tools, and you've identified, namely, for example, as one of those. What can you expand on how we can, as a international network of concerned civil society, help you spread those tools, and what tools would you think would be best for the vast majority of users?
Well, first of all, I don't have a silver bullet, of course, and greater minds than mine have attempted to address this problem and are hard at work as we speak. But being a teacher, of course, my first answer is going to be education. I think the biggest challenge about education right now is the battle over legitimate information. And the only thing I can say right now is that we have to keep telling the truth. We have to keep telling complete truth. And we have to debunk misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation anywhere that we see it. Sometimes, when I think about students, and this, I always think of, particularly, I spent 12 years teaching 8th graders, and a lot of the things that they'll say or do, or they're testing out their identity, and you don't want to squash them by chewing them out over something that they may not understand or they may be experimenting with. It's a better approach to ask things like, well, how did you find that information? Or what makes you think that? And having a conversation rather than a confrontation. And I think we're seeing that's true around things like vaccine mythology, that the most effective thing, it turns out, was to have the family doctor, the religious figure in the community, your friends and neighbors. Those were the people who had the greatest impact on people who were resistant to getting vaccines. So as much as we might want our governments or these large institutions to be solving problems, it really does come down to how we communicate with one another. And I would simply say that, again, having conversations is better than having confrontations.
Yeah, I would just do a bit of a building on what you've just said, because what we've discovered, I think, as we grapple with how we better help each other provide useful, as best we can, truthful, validated information. We need each other's help, don't we?
We do.
I mean, we can have our best, but my best isn't probably going to be as good if I'm dealing with a neuroscience subject. I'd rather have a neuroscience person to have a discussion with and straighten me out and have it really expands. I love what you're doing in the schools and public schools. That is, of course, the basis, and then hopefully we'll reach a generation of people. And the people that are now beyond that, how we help each other is going to be very, very important. So any guidance that can be done, it seems to me that what is being taught to children in the schools should be likewise taught the adults. And the difference between the adults and the children is the adults can be encouraged to talk to one another and realize that you're more likely to be saying something accurate after you've tested it out amongst a group of fellow trusted advisors, right? So I really commend you for what you're doing, and if you have any other suggestions that could be made as to how we adults can better deal with helping each other, encourage and each other practice truth-telling, please provide it.
Well, I would add one other thing, and I think modeling it for young people, but modeling it for each other, modeling best practices, and particularly, I'm going to pull a little bit from the researcher Brene Brown and say making ourselves a little vulnerable, owning our own mistakes and owning them publicly. I certainly am guilty myself of spreading things, tweeting something forward too fast, or sharing something on Facebook without really looking at it because the person who posted it is somebody I know, and then discovering later that it was something that was not correct. Case in point, for example, you may recall it was a couple of years ago. It's always like pre-COVID. It was pre-COVID, but I don't know by how much. There was an incident here in front of the Lincoln Memorial that involved a group of high school students and a group of Native Americans. At least that's what we saw in the video. And so it looked as if the young people were confronting the Native Americans and that they were laughing. And certainly I took that at face value when it first came out. And a good friend said, no, I think it might be helpful if you looked at the other videos that are coming out now from different angles. And I appreciated that she very thoughtfully made that suggestion. Again, a conversation instead of a confrontation. And so and once I had looked at them, you could see that there were other parties involved, that you started hearing interviews with the Native Americans. They were actually trying to intervene in what they thought was a brewing conflict. And so there was a lot more to it. And I made sure to put something out there that, that was my mistake. I had forwarded something, reposted, shared something that was inaccurate. And I think it's important to own it when we do.
I think that's wonderful, useful information. I just share a couple of things in my life which were incredibly humbling. One of them happened just the other day, but I was a minister responsible for Indigenous affairs, and I publicly spoke to many Indigenous peoples. And I once, in a very important speech, used the term missionary zeal to make a point. And I realized that by using that terminology, I triggered the multi-generational trauma of many people in the room, who kindly brought that to my attention afterwards. And I realized how important it is. You can, in the most innocent, good-meaning ways, do those kinds of things, and again, acknowledging the mistake and then trying your best not to make it happen, but knowing it will, as it did just the other day. And Gary and his wife, Darcy, would pick up on this one quickly. When I was at a Rotary Club and I spoke about the Ukraine, I was approached afterwards by a Ukrainian lawyer, senior lawyer, who I know very, very well. And he said, David, I want you to know how badly it hurt me to hear you say the Ukraine when you should have said Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And he said, you were using Putin's language. And I said, I realized that the moment I said it, and I'm glad it brought it to my attention. Mm-hmm. But it's just the way we can use a three-letter word to diminish or give a misunderstood version of something that, again, is intended. So the lesson you've taught me again today is make yourself vulnerable, admit your mistakes, and humbly make a commitment to try not to do it again. So
that's
thanks
all
so
of us.
much, Kate.
That's all of us, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. It was a very illuminating discussion. So now let me welcome Gary Sent to this discussion. Gary, you are following Ukraine war very closely, and we appreciate your insights. So floor is yours, sir. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Luther, and thank you, Kate, for your words, and David for your comments. What's interesting is both David and I are lawyers, and we look at the power of words. And when you think of demeaning people, and often when you get into these genocides, it's words that are used to demean the other. Mm-hmm. And quite often the words that are used are really, they don't make sense even. Mm-hmm. Like calling a human a cockroach in the Rwanda case, or in the case of the war with Russia, where Putin is saying they're Nazis. And you pointed out, well, that seems unlikely, given the history of the nation, and also that Zelensky is in fact of Jewish heritage and had quite an experience, which would lead him not to be. So how is it that those words have such meaning? How do they sustain themselves? Is it just the repetition?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. If you, I don't. So I'm going to just be clear. I don't know the correct attribution for this thought, but there. I think it was under Nazi rule, but I don't know for sure. So I don't want to say for sure. But that idea that if you tell a lie long enough and loud enough, it becomes the truth. I know there are quotes of Goebbels talking about how easy it is to manipulate the masses by telling them messages they want to hear and blaming somebody else and so forth. But we've definitely seen that happen here, where somebody just continually, former president continually says the election was stolen, the election was stolen, the election was stolen, no matter how many times people give him information to prove that it was not, that there were no problems with the voting, that there were no illegal ballots, no dead people voting, there were I think in the hearing the other day, they said, I think it was in Georgia, that there were 4 that they found. But he continues to say the election was stolen. Joe Biden is not the legitimate president. And what we would get from the most recent hearings is that he knew all along that that was a lie, but repeats it loudly and often enough, and people believe it.
So when we're talking about tools, and David was asking what tools are there, in terms of educating, the human power of curiosity is one that I think could be helpful to us. So in other words, you hear something, you think, that's just not quite right. How do we stimulate that curiosity to go deeper? And then the second element would be critical thinking. Where you look at the subject, the comment, and you say, well, that really just doesn't seem to make sense. So I'm going to think that through a little more. So just in terms of education, what are we doing to stimulate the youth of today and tomorrow to really use those tools in their fullest?
Well, I think this is another case where Canada is out in front of the United States. We've been moving backward on that score. I'm sure you've been watching the discussions about forbidding the teaching of critical race theory, which isn't even something that would be taught at a secondary level, which translates, though, into we can't talk about the history of African Americans and Black people in our country. We can't talk about their enslavement. You can't talk about the systemic impact of 6 generations being enslaved and the generations since then still working to rise from those ashes, and doing so with great success a lot of the time until they are knocked down again by white supremacists, as we saw with the Tulsa massacre and Black Wall Street. So we are, I will say, American teachers are a little despondent on this point right now, doing our best to confront in this case, and power through it, and hopefully with the support of good administrators and boards of education. But there are plenty of places here that concur with that view, that we don't want anybody feeling guilty, as that was the one poster I had up in the PowerPoint, insinuating that there was, you had to be proud of being white, as if somebody was going to take something away from you, which of course is bullpucky. So what we have to do is persevere, and that's often the most difficult, because you can't see the light at the end of the tunnel yet. And I also think it's useful to think about, in terms of collective action, it can be a useful metaphor to talk about music programs. I happen to have been a singer in high school, and I was in chorus, but you could say the same thing about a band, where you might have a sustained note that the chorus is singing that goes on for bars and bars. And everybody is singing together, but you pace yourself. So somebody drops out and takes a breath while everybody else sings, and then somebody else takes a breath later. So we're all contributing to the moving forward. And sometimes we stop and take a breath and then jump back in. There was something else that you mentioned that came to mind too. I think one of the things that I didn't mention with the PowerPoint is that the most effective lies have a kernel of truth to them. And that's also the case in Ukraine. They did have an issue with, just like a lot of countries do, US and Canada included, with extreme right-wing groups, not just neo-Nazis, but Proud Boys and Three Percenters and all the rest. And they had that issue in Ukraine as well. But to suggest that the government was sponsoring it, of course, is absolutely untrue. In fact, the government was doing their best to combat it. But that's when they can point to something where there is that kernel of truth. It has to do with the extremism that we're all dealing with, unfortunately, today.
In Canada, it's interesting. We've had the Freedom Convoy, and on July 1st, there may be some further protests.
Oh,
Yes, and so there's a rallying by that group around the word freedom.
Yeah.
And they're actually, turning a situation where Canada is one, I believe, of the freest countries, and there's indexes that indicate that. But using a word like freedom and suggesting that's what's being taken away in a country that has, some deep roots in freedom is an interesting thing. So, how you turn, as you're mentioning, what may be partially true, everyone's always worried about the freedoms and losing them, but turning that into a sort of a battle cry when you're in one of the freest nations just seems a little interesting, if not perverse.
Well, and in fact, both in terms of the truckers in Ottawa and the ones that came here to the capital, what they're really trying to do is imprison other people to make their point. They're trying to remove other people's freedoms in pursuit of what they believe they're not getting. I recall the interviews with folks who lived on those streets in Ottawa that couldn't get out of their homes because of the truckers.
This is something that I'm very conscious of now, is that we cannot have, we have the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. And I repeatedly make the point to them and to teachers and students and certainly civil society groups that, and use the convoy use of the word freedom as a right, to make the point that no right should be seen unconnected. Inextricably, it is inextricably connected to responsibilities.
Absolutely.
And commensurately, right? And the unfortunate thing is that we failed with our pedagogy and our curricula, apparently, to get this through to a lot of people in the United States and Canada through our education systems. Hopefully, in the K-12 systems, we are bringing home that position. I can tell you, with newcomers who come here that I have the privilege of getting to know, and the challenges in adjusting. One of the big challenges that the parents have that bring young children with them, they get into the school system and they learn all about rights, and then they challenge the parents. And the parents don't know how to discipline in a no corporal punishment world, and it becomes a very serious divisive issue within families. And the missing piece here is the responsibilities that go with rights, and responsibilities that children have as well as adults. So it is a very complicated thing in an increasingly diverse world, where you've come from different cultures and different values and different I would say steps in the evolution of a more human rights and responsibilities, universal acceptance in a local to global way. So Gary, thanks for making that point. Do you have any observations to make about that, Kate?
Well, as you were saying that, I can think of something that's very important to us here right now, that would be both things at the same time. It would be both a right and a responsibility. And I think too often we think of it as only a right, and that is the vote. We think about having the right to vote, but I don't know that we have emphasized enough the responsibility to vote.
Well, obviously we haven't, given the voter turnouts and the failures of both our democracies in Canada and the United States, for citizens to feel that great sense of responsibility like was exhibited during Mandela's freedom from prison, and the lineups of people that went miles and miles to stand in a line to have the privilege of voting in an election where they could choose a person of their own culture and heritage and race to escape from the dominant apartheid in South Africa. So the indigenous people have a very conscious understanding because of their concept of all our relations and everybody being every sentient, non-sentient beings, being human and otherwise, being inextricably connected and also interdependent. And the wonderful quote that comes out of a book called Braiding Sweetgrass is the concept that hopefully at some point the earth and the non-human sentient non-sentient beings will be able to express gratitude to humans, and the converse of most of the book is about our responsibility to appreciate all of the things that we take for granted, and of course the essence of life, and that's the water and air and the earth and the energy which is there for us, and the ecosystems which function without human intervention, right? So I think this is what you're saying is all a part of the growing understanding that we must think far beyond our tribes and our clans and our families and our races and our own nations, and think about everyone everywhere, and the generations that preceded us and the generations after us, and how our decisions and our words are impacting, and actions are impacting all of those essential parts of a broad definition of a global human family. So it's a big step for you educators to have to take.
Well, and in fact, when I think about misinformation, malinformation, disinformation, anti-Semitism, propaganda, denial of genocides, we can go back to that, especially now in a globalized, technologically connected community, that the old adage could never be more true, that the lie goes around the world before the truth can even get out of bed in the morning. Yeah. So somewhere along the line, I think one of the things that's the most deeply troubling is the lack of trust in institutions that are trustworthy.
And isn't that as significant? I mean, can't we go back thousands of years? Can't we go back to even the Old Testament, which speaks of dominion over? And it isn't dominion over and humans, and isn't that something which really now doesn't stand up to science, right? And doesn't the whole foundations of colonization, of colonialism, it was on racial superiority or religious superiority, and don't we still have so much of that are part of what would be called and doctrines of religions, and those doctrines of religions, do they stand up to the test of science? And if you talk about length and repetition, how many hundreds of years have we heard this repeated to us, and it's become part of virtually our DNA in the enduring world religions. So I'm a great now questioner of the impacts of what organized religion has done, and the consequences of it. So if we want to really deal with truth, and we want to deal with information and all of the forms of it, we're going to have to deal with organized religion and what religion is doing to disseminate the messaging, and what is really an awesome, I would say, intimidation. In other words, if you don't follow that truth, you're not going to heaven or paradise, you're going to hell, right?
Well, as a final thought, if I may, years ago, I remember reading that all of the major religions have one thing in common, And that is an essential version in some form of the golden rule of doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, of empathy. And so for that reason, I would say that while certainly the world's religions have plenty of examples of corruption and causing of pain and so forth, there are millions of people of good faith in the world who are doing their very best to live up to that idea of taking care of others the way you would hope that they would look out for you.
Kate, it's Carrie. I would just say thank you for that, because I think that's a very important point that you make. And there's an organization, the Parliament of World Religions, that works very hard on trying to really emphasize the golden rule and watch out for those man-made devices that seem to take religions off into a wrong direction. So I think that's a powerful thing that you're mentioning there with the impact of the golden rule if it were followed more closely. I'll just close with, in terms of tools that we were talking about, persistence in trying to find the truth, and just more resilience in trying to deal with the challenges that we're facing. I'm afraid that for our current generation, there are so many challenges that are existential in nature that it can be quite difficult and even potentially harmful, from a mental state perspective. So I'd encourage resilience and persistence in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear audience, we are absolutely at the end of our session. It was such a fascinating discussion. It is very difficult for me to close it and just to stop the flow of the discussion. But nonetheless, we have allotted 1 hour and we have just over 2 minutes. Before I formally conclude, I would like to request Kate to comment on very briefly about what do you think, Kate, would be our best approach to appeal to Russian diaspora living in our countries to think about the war itself and what is going on? What would be your message in that line, if you might want to say? Thank you.
Wow. Okay. Easy question to close on. So when you say Russian diaspora, I would gather that there are those who would be in sympathy with Putin's messaging, but I would imagine that most of the Russian people who have left Russia did so for reasons that might separate themselves from that administration. And so I think they have to be in a terrible position. I know there are kids who have been getting called out for having Russian names, or musicians and artists who are being boycotted when they themselves are doing what they can to be supportive of Ukrainian people. So I think just pause and try and understand where that person is on that spectrum, and then before making assumptions.
Thank you so much. Such a powerful closing. The audience, before I close formally, let me do a round of gratitude to Kate for coming in, and also two of our advisors who joined this discussion and made this discussion lively. We are talking about Project IDEA, funded by Department of Heritage under the Digital Citizenship Contribution Program. Our objective is to fight disinformation and bring the truth. And as you have heard from Kate and others, truth is at stake here. As I always believe as a student of peace and conflict studies, war is the ultimate failure of imagination of solving a problem. And this is what is happening in front of us in 2022, which we possibly never imagined. So with this couple of thoughts, we would like to conclude this session. Please tune in our third webinar, which is coming very quickly. And we are going to invite another guest speaker to speak on these dimensions and how do we really seek truth and fight misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Thank you so much. Stay well and stay safe. Bye-bye.